Got a lot of issues that we're working on right now. Some of the big ones include the budget conversation. Budget conversation really circles around, for the first time in a long time, how are we going to get back to balance? It's an interesting dialogue. There's a lot of dispute about elements of the president's budget. There'll be a lot of controversy back and forth about aspects in the House and the Senate proposals. But for the first time in a long time, the beginning point of the conversation is, how do we get back to balance? That's a good place to start. And I'm pleased to see that's a part of the conversation again. There's a tremendous number of things that have to be dealt with in this process, and let me just bring up two quick ones, and then I want to be able to talk about some of the small business issues that we're facing. One of them is, when we go through the budget process, I encourage my colleagues to deal with the budget gimmicks that are still in place in the budget process. Areas that seem to bring down the deficit, but we all know actually do not. Those don't help us as Americans. That may help some sort of scoring issue. That doesn't really help where we are. The second aspect to that is, let's actually put the appropriation bills on the floor. For the last several years, there's been continuing resolutions or omnibus without any amendment process brought. We should be able to, in a bipartisan way, agree to bring these appropriation bills to the floor, actually have an amendment process, actually deal with this in a public setting. There's straightforward ways to be able to deal with our debt and deficit. It begins with actually confronting debt and deficit in a way that'll really matter. It is interesting as well, when we talk about a lot of different big issues, often regulations come up as one of the prime regulations. Regulations are often big, expensive, and deal with a lot of controversy. But quite frankly, there are thousands of regulations out there that impact small businesses. For our small businesses, it's not typically just one regulation. It's the hundreds of little ones that they're constantly trying to live under. It's the culmination of all these different regulations and trying to figure out where they are. Most small businesses don't have lawyers. They don't have compliance people. They don't have folks lined up to be able to monitor all these things. They have to try to figure it out as they go. They're a small business. They're a family-owned business. They're trying to be able to take care of their own family and the neighbors around them. But yet all these regulations come at them as well. Let me read you what Karen Kerrigan, the president and CEO of the Small Business and Entrepreneur Council, wrote in an op-ed just last week. She wrote, "Red tape is strangling our small business and undermining entrepreneurship. Indeed, according to the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council research, the cumulative loss of new businesses over the last decade totals 3.42 million missing businesses, not workers, businesses in America's economy. For existing small businesses, the per employee cost of regulation is just over $11,000 per employee. Excessive regulation in the U.S. has hurt our competitiveness in the global economy. The U.S. ranks 51st in the world for ease of starting a business, according to World Bank. The same report is consistent with other global studies that have found America's friendliness and general ease of doing business has eroded year after year. That's according to Karen Kerrigan, President and CEO of the Small Business Entrepreneurship Council, in her op-ed last week. Each new regulation on small business adds another cost, another burden, another requirement which small businesses have to comply with. This cumulative burden is crushing small business. Let me give you some examples. Julian Lumber Company in Antlers, Oklahoma. You ought to come and see Antlers, Oklahoma. It's a beautiful area of our state. But for Julian Lumber Company there, that family-owned business makes wooden fence posts, treated poles. If you've got a telephone pole in that area or other posts and poles, it often came from Julian Lumber Company. It also has a small trucking company to be able to haul posts to retail stores across the Midwest and the Southwest. Julian employs about 50 people, but recently had to shift a part-time employee doing compliance to being actually full-time doing nothing but compliance 40 hours a week because of all the federal regulations. When Robert Julian founded this business in 1974, he didn't set out to just create jobs for compliance officers. He actually set out to do lumber work. But unfortunately now his business also includes federal compliance. Small businesses are vital to our economy. Surely we can agree on that. They drive job creation and innovation. And excessive and poorly crafted government regulation, disproportionately, the burden of them fall on small businesses and on their growth. If Julian Lumber has got to hire more people just to do compliance, not just lumber, there's a problem. How about Anders Shoe Store in Miami, Oklahoma, which was founded in 1930 by Joe Ander after he immigrated to Oklahoma from Poland. Today, Anders Shoe Store is owned and operated by Joe's daughter, Dina Ander, who is 102 years old. She has worked at Anders Shoe Store for 86 years. My favorite quote ever from a small business owner came from her when she said at 101 that her health is better than her help, and so she just keeps working. Dina Anders is not waking up every day and reading the Federal Register to find out what new federal regulation came down. She's not trying to track through all the different compliance officers and attorneys that you'd have to be able to contact to try to figure out how to read a new federal regulation that comes down. She's taking care of a shoe store in Miami, Oklahoma. She has 2 employees, but her shoe store has to live by the same regulations that a lot of large stores also have to live by. Every member of this body, when they're home, they talk about small businesses and the importance of small businesses, how to help them succeed. I'm asking, are we willing as a body to do what we said we were going to do back home? In Oklahoma, 97% of the businesses in my state are small businesses. Lots of us have made promises to these small businesses. It is time to fulfill them. Regulatory reform for even small businesses, for whatever reasons, becoming politicized. This is not a political Republican-Democrat issue. Small business owners are not Republicans or Democrats. They're Americans. They're people. And this shouldn't be a partisan issue. And I'd be willing to work with every senator of any party to be able to get this task done. I've introduced the Small Business Regulatory Flexibility Improvement Act. It has now passed its way through committee. It is S-584. It does some simple things that should not be controversial. It closes loopholes in the Regulatory Flexibility Act, which became law in 1980. That bill was designed to help small businesses, but there's so many loopholes in it that the agencies are going around it. This is not a bill that I just came up with on my own. It's a bill that's been drafted in direct response to small businesses and small business leaders around the country. It's been discussed for a long time, but for whatever reason, it's never been passed. I want to run through a few quick things that it does. First, the agencies should account for the economic impact of regulations, especially on small business, and it should be the full economic impact. The agencies have this little caveat that they'll do. They'll say, well, it's not a direct cost, it's an indirect cost on business. So they'll put a new regulation on them and say, we're only going to count direct costs of regulations, but we're not going to count anything indirect, like electricity usage on it, or like a state, if they put a federal regulation down and a state entity is then required to create new regulations based on it, they won't count the state regulations based on it. Or if it's permitting from a different agency that'll be required, they'll say, well, that's somebody else that does that. Well, if you're a small business, cost is cost is cost. The federal government plays this game of what's a direct and indirect cost to a business. A small business doesn't get to play that game. They have to pay the bills for it. So it's a very simple thing for us to say, include just the cost. And we try to get some clear language on it. Agency would have to consider reasonably foreseeable impacts. So I get you're not going to get every pencil in the process, but what's reasonably foreseeable, you should be able to anticipate that. Second, we require the IRS to actually listen to small businesses before they release IRS rules. So many hours are spent by every small business complying with IRS regulations and requirements. We like to have the IRS actually engage with small businesses when they put out policy and guidance to say, how is this going to affect small businesses? How can they work this out to make sure it's as easy as possible for small business owners? Third, increase the transparency in the rulemaking process. Small businesses tell me that when they learn of new regulatory requirements, they're often blindsided. They had no idea the rule was even coming. In the rare instance when a small business owner speaks out to an agency, they're often confused when they see the final rule because it doesn't look at all like what they had recommended or had raised. Years ago, there was something created called sub-brifa panels. Only Washington, D.C. could come up with a term like that. It's small businesses that were supposed to be able to engage with the federal government on designing how regulations would come out. But again, the loopholes were so present in the law that the agencies are just going around them. We need to close that. As simple as it sounds, when an agency is creating a rule, don't you think they should call small businesses and say, how will this work at your place? Or will it work at all? Fourth, let's deal with old rules. There are lots of regulations that are out there that are old, that become very complicated for small businesses to be able to maintain, and no one's ever gone back to look at them. Let's create a simple system that when a rule comes out, it has to be reviewed within 10 years. That way we have no rule that's 40, 50 years old and no one's even touched it or looked at it to make sure it still works, number one, and it's not overly complicating the process. Finally, here's something pretty straightforward. Give first-time forgiveness for paperwork violations. Small businesses, when they have a paperwork violation, they had a paperwork violation. They're not trying to break the law. They're not trying to violate regulations. They missed one. Why don't we give first-time grace to small businesses? Now, I wouldn't say that if it's violating health and safety issues. Obviously, those are things they should have already taken care of as well. But just paperwork things. We have so many small businesses that get a fine because they missed a piece of paperwork. And again, I go back to so many small businesses don't have compliance people tracking this stuff for them all the time, and occasionally they make a mistake. This is still a government that works for them. They don't work for the government. So my simple recommendation is, for small businesses, give them first-time paperwork forgiveness rather than a federal compliance person showing up their place with a fine. Let's be reasonable about this. And that should be a simple, straightforward thing. Quite frankly, these are all things that small business owners have asked for. These are things even in the Obama administration. The Chief Counsel for Small Business Administration's Office of Advocacy for Small Businesses, this is what the Obama administration small business advocacy wanted. I do not understand how this could be a partisan issue. It's simple, straightforward, clean. There's no hidden anything in the bill. It's trying to actually get regulatory relief and common sense back into the way we do regulations. Over 200 trade associations representing millions of small businesses have already written me in support of this bill from all over the country, not from Oklahoma, from all over the country. Many in this chamber pride themselves as being the advocate for the little guy, as standing up for small businesses. I would ask my colleagues if you're ready to actually put feet to those words. This is a straightforward way to do it. We talk about helping small businesses. Let's actually do it. And I'd ask my colleagues to be able to walk alongside of us and help us get this bill passed and get some regulatory relief. With that, I'd yield the floor.